Okay, good. All right. Hey, Gio. All right. We're going to start on page 227 today in our book. And I see we have Jim Sinclair. Welcome, Jim. So the last few chapters, we've been looking at ways in which Kabbalah expanded the idea of God's image beyond what rabbinic midrash had said. And of course, a lot of the time, what we've been doing up till now is looking at how rabbinic midrash expanded the idea of God's image beyond what the Torah explicitly says. The Torah gives us so little to go on in terms of what it really means that we can't be sure what the Torah is meaning to leave out or leave in when it talks about God's image. But we saw a lot of different ways that the rabbis expanded the concept. And then we've talked the past 3 weeks, I think it's been, of some of the ways that Kabbalah expanded God's image in very specific ways. You know, fruit trees, the Torah is the image of God, the Mishkan, different ways of looking at the human body as being in God's image, the foundational principle in Kabbalah, which is that the body is the image of God, not just the soul, not just the intellect, which is aligned with rabbinic Judaism, but much expanded in terms of their idea of the fractal scale of the image of God in the human body. So that's all stuff we've been talking about. And we especially talked last week about the different paradigms for what constitutes something that is like the image of God. That is something which in which the lower world mirrors the upper world, can be a dimension of God's image. Anything which unites upper and lower can also be seen as God's image. And anything which includes an entire dimension, the wholeness of creation on some dimension, say all the colors or all the animals, that also can represent God's image. So those were the three paradigms. I'm not sure if paradigm is the right word. Anyway, structural ways of looking at the image of God and sort of grouping the different examples, like the rainbow, the fruit trees, the body of a bird, these different kinds of things. The human is still uniquely in God's image because the human has this kind of, as I mentioned, fractal dimension to God's image, and because in those three paradigms, humans are all three of those. That is, our being on the lower realms, in the lower realms, is reflective of or parallel to the upper realms specifically, and that's already rabbinic midrash, which says that that the humans are in the image of God like the upper realms, but are animal or reproductive or whatever we want to say, different things about the physical body like the lower realms, so that somehow we combine the two, which also implies or is the foundation for the idea that human beings link the upper and the lower. This is not news to you all. I think you all know this pretty well by now. And the idea that the human embodies the wholeness of creation, that the universe as a whole is like an Adam Gadol, is something we've talked about. So what it means for humans to be in God's image is, on some level, that we have all aspects of creation within us, whatever that means, however we want to explain what that means. That for the rabbis, but then more explicitly for the Kabbalists, was the image of God. Now, these structures of God's image leave out big realms of the lower worlds. So the upper worlds are more or less agreed upon by everyone, though that's in the image of God. That includes the heavens, it includes the planetary bodies, it includes the stars, as well as the angels, as well as the Sphirot and the realms beyond the realms that we can conceive. But on the lower level, only specific types of creatures or types of phenomenon are cast in the role of image of God. And that leaves out a lot. And so the question that chapter 8 begins to answer, and then the next two chapters go on to explore more deeply, is there some way in which we can talk about those aspects of being which have nothing to do with any of those paradigms? That is, mirroring of above and below, linking above to below, or representing the whole. And sort of the paradigm for what a creature would be that doesn't fit any of those paradigms is a rock. Yeah. So how is or could or should we want to say that a rock is in God's image? And one of the questions you could ask about what I'm talking about here, that is critical questions that you could say, why are you doing this in the first place? Why are you worrying about this? Is what does it matter if some things aren't in God's image? It's not actually, from a perspective of what we want to do ethically with the idea of the image of God, it would be enough to say that the creation itself is in the image of God, and it would be enough to say that somehow the holism of every dimension of creation speaks to or participates in, to use the language of a particular Kabbalist, participates in the image of God. So if holism is something that participates in the image of God, and an ecosystem represents on a small scale the wholeness of creation as a whole, sorry, I'm repeating myself, the wholeness of creation, right, is represented on a small scale in the wholeness of an ecosystem that is sustained by all the interrelationships of all the creatures. It's not much of a stretch to say that the ecosystem also embodies in some fractal way the image of God. That's not a problem. It's not something that the Kabbalists said specifically, but they also didn't have the notion of an ecosystem. So it's not surprising that they didn't say that. But it fits the structure of their thought to say that an ecosystem, which is kind of like a whole creation on a certain level, in a certain way, that an ecosystem itself is or can represent in some sense the image of God. So what if the rocks aren't in God's image? Do you understand why it's in a way, it's not actually an important point for ecotheology to say whether a rock is or is not in God's image. It's more like a question of curiosity. How far can we go with this paradigm? And what does it mean to us? Sorry, I was being bothered by the crookedness of that picture. Now let's crook it the other way. Okay, I'll leave it be. The truth is, things get distorted from this angle with these computer cameras anyway, so they're not going to be, I'm probably not going to be able to get it to look straight to myself. Anyway, let me see. Does anyone want to mention something right now? Yeah, go ahead, Rita.
So I mean, you can think about a rock being part of the image of God, because what would our universe be without rocks?
Yeah.
If
more.
we didn't have rocks, it'd be a loss. It
Well,
wouldn't be
there wouldn't
complete.
be an Earth without a rock.
Right.
So, but that's different than saying that it is or is not important to say that rocks are somehow participating in God's image. It doesn't mean to say that something is ontologically irrelevant to say that it's not in God's image. That doesn't mean that.
Okay.
Yeah.
What?
I'm more, like I said, for me, it's more a matter of curiosity. How far do we want to expand this idea of God's image? And surely we want to prioritize life over not life in how we understand the image of God. So if we are prioritizing life, at least in the normal definition of life, so rocks are not alive in that sense. In a Native American context,
It's important.
yeah, rocks would be considered in some sense as having spirit. So
They
does
call
that
grandmother
apply?
father.
What's that, Nayana?
The few Native people that I know and the situations I've been in, the Native people call them grandmother and grandfather and consider the rocks their ancestors.
Mm-hmm.
And
that is literally true in many ways if you think about it scientifically. That is, especially when well, there's many different ways to understand
and
that make it
rocks
true.
have consciousness.
What's that, Ellen? Couldn't hear you. Ellen, I think you froze for us.
Rocks have consciousness. Rocks have.
How would we know whether that's true or not?
I've experienced it. Does that make it true? It makes
Maybe
it true
it might.
for me. I mean, I've had some very sustained.
The human way of being conscious, though, is so expansive, potentially expansive. In a way, anything can feel conscious to us because we can take it into our own consciousness. And so, is that a testable proposition? Probably not. Probably not. Maybe. You know, it's an interesting question. I mean, we call God our rock, right? So, Renu,
Yeah.
if God is called a rock, does that mean that a rock is in God's image? Should that mean a rock is in God's image if we call God a rock? It's a fine question. On a poetic level, it seems almost obvious that on some level, if God is a rock, if we want to call God our rock, then that must mean somehow that the rock is, in the very simple metaphorical sense, the image of God, right? An image of God. But what would make a rock, what about a rock makes it like that? When we call God our rock, what are we talking about? You know, what does it mean? What is a rock to us, you could say?
It's, to me, I think liturgically we're saying it is stability, safety, a grounding point that is less changeable, something that is reliable in those sort of metaphorical ways. But literally, I mean, if we're saying that the land or the earth is also in God's image, I mean, I think when we think of rock, we're thinking something that fits in our hand, but a rock is a mountain. A rock is the rocky planet we're on.
Right.
You know, a rock doesn't have to be a small thing.
Right.
And I think I heard your question just a little differently, like less is a rock in the image of God or not, which I think is an interesting question, but what does it mean for anything to be in the image of God? Mm-hmm. And it seems like that is asking whether we find something to be worthy of our attention, worthy to be in relation to, worthy to treat with respect, and perhaps as if it has some part in a larger agency, if not even its own agency. What does that, is it something that is consumable, or is it something that we regard as having value beyond our engagement with it? And even those things that we consume, maybe we give more value to, and just inquire more deeply into.
Yeah. So if what it means to be in God's image is that something is a moral end in itself, to use the Kantian language, that means you have to look at it with regard to its value for itself and not with regard to its use value for you. But if everything is God's image, then that would imply that we can't use anything. If you want to take it in the simplest version, right? And obviously we can't survive in a world where we can't use things. So we have to define God's image as something different than just the value of something as an end in itself, meaning that it can't be used, because we have to use.
But I'm remembering what you were saying about.
What's that, Ellen? And then go back to Toby. Ellen, try turning off your video so we can hear you, because I'm not getting you. When you
with
speak.
Permission. It's like if someone was going to ask if anyone was to ask permission to lop the top off the mountain, mm-hmm. It wouldn't get permission. But it's like, do we ask permission? When I left Woodstock, because I had a whole 11 circle labyrinth and an Omer garden and other holy spaces on the land, I brought some of those stones with me and have mm-hmm. made different things with them. Yeah. And they are different than stones that hadn't. New York City is built on an amazing piece of granite, the whole city. That's why it can have skyscrapers. When I lived there and worked with the Theosophical Society, we would do meditations for the city that included the granite as a living conscious being. I mean, it's kind of And I've got a lot of stones here that are just stones. It's like animals that are beloved parts of the family tend to be different from barn animals, for example. I mean, barn cats. So when something heightens to be in relationship with us, it takes on, it's more attuned to these qualities. If it's not qualities isn't the right word, but like Sur, I don't know your name, but you said all those things: reliable, strong, steady. You can stand on it. You can let yourself sink into it. All of those things are part of what we're living with. If we treat them as having some consciousness, it's like, I mean, I've been also studied with people who talked a lot about the consciousness of stones, that it's so much slower because it's over such a huge amount of time,
Right.
that we don't necessarily get that. But some other time I can tell some stories.
So let's do some text to add. Oh, for some reason it's not letting me share screen. Simcha has shifted me back to being host. See if I can share screen if I do that. Oh yeah, now I can share. So we're gonna do some text in short order right now. So first of all, I want to look at this one text. This is the Ishbitzer. It's not the Ishbitzer, it's the son of the Ishbitzer. Yaakov Leiner, not Mordechai Yosef Leiner. I'm not going to go into who the Ishbitzer was, but he's a very famous Rebbe, and Shlomo Karabach actually made a big point of pushing his teaching, for reasons that, when you know about Shlomo's history, get complicated and difficult. But put that aside for now. Maybe we'll come back to it. We'll see. But this is his son. Now we're going to look at what he thinks about the animal kingdom, and then look at what he thinks about the rocks. And this is going to fit very closely into what Ellen just said, in a beautiful way, I think. So the question he's trying to answer is, how is the ox in the chariot of Ezekiel, which in a Kabbalistic perspective is part of the image of God, how is that connected to the ox that lives, on a farm in the world? And this is how he explains it. The beast branches from the ox that's in the chariot, where the chayot, that's the name for the animals that are the part of the wheels of Ezekiel's chariot, where the chayot stand in radiance always, without ever forgetting God. And because they never forget God, even for a second, they can't remember anything about themselves. So therefore, the ox branches off from the beasts of the field. The ox above, from the ox above, branches off the beasts of the field, meaning not just the ox, but all the domesticated animals, all the animals that we work with, which in this world are completely without awareness and do not have erect posture. Okay, there's a lot of ideology going on here, which we might not say about if we're just coming fresh to experiences with animals, trying to make it fit into Jewish thought. Because animals are aware of themselves in various ways and to various degrees. But what he wants to say is that an animal is not aware of itself. And also, he doesn't say it in this particular quote, but it's related. They don't speak. The reason why they don't speak is because they are so close to God's presence that their desire to speak is overwhelmed by their awe, in a way. So it's a sweet idea. It's not really true, because animals do have some kind of awareness. There's no question that they do. And they have desires, and they're not simply standing in God's radiance at all times. But for Yaakov Leiner, it's in a way of explaining how animals can still be connected to the image of God, even though they don't have things that are, from a midrashic perspective, essential to God's image, which is having language and having erect posture. So what's interesting about this, though, is that it implies that the reason why humans can speak and the reason why we have erect posture, which kind of promotes our own egos, is because we're less aware of God. And that's already a very interesting concept. There is a wackadoodle guru in the world. I don't know if he's still around. Named Da Frijan. Anyone heard of him?
Say it again. What's his name again?
Da Frijan used to be his name. Now he has some long name. And, you know, he's totally treif because he basically claims to be a god and has people worship his idol. So that's bad from our perspective, from the Jewish perspective. But he does say one thing that I find fascinating, which is that he says the reason why animals don't speak also is because they're contemplating God all the time. And therefore we have to treat them in a way that makes sure we don't disturb their contemplation. And even though there are many things to say about this teacher that are less positive, and even though I don't think this is true about animals per se, in the literal phenomenological sense, to me it strikes me as a very beautiful idea. That somehow animals could be in contemplation and that we have a responsibility to them to protect their contemplative practice. And that fits right into what what Yaakov Leiner is saying. Now that's interesting enough, but what I want to really focus on is what he says about rocks. So I'm going to just jump ahead to that part. Where is Leiner? Here he goes. Here we go. This is the quote. No, I keep going past the page. I have to go slowly here.
Is that 235?
Yes. 233. No, not 233. 230. Oh boy, I keep jumping around pages. Yes, it is 235. Okay, so we just read the part about animals, which he said, this is the immediately following paragraph. The silent ones, and people know that the world in Hasidic thought is divided up into 4 categories of being, and this is also reflected in medieval thought and in Kabbalah, which is the domem, the silent ones, which are the rocks, and everything that we think of as not alive. We, the general we, right? Someach, those things which grow, the plant kingdom. I think that would also include the fungus kingdom, even though they weren't aware of the distinction. The chai, which is all the animals, and the medaber, which means the speaking animal, which is humans for most of them, although we might include within speaking animal a whole bunch of other species that really seem to come close to speech. Yeah. So he's talking about the domain, and when someone's talking about it, they're talking about what we call more roughly the mineral kingdom. Yeah. So the silent ones from this world branch off from a high place, even higher than the animals. Here's a parable he gives us. One who stands before the king voids himself completely from existence because of the awe he feels. This is an interesting idea. The idea of voiding oneself is a specifically Hasidic way of talking about this. Being mevatel, oneself. Bitul hayesh is the terminology used in Chabad for this. The nullification of the what is, or of the what the there is. Bitul hayesh. So he's saying that rocks are so close to God's throne, to God's being, that they not only can't they talk the way an animal can't talk, they're even closer to God's being, and so they can't move because they're so in such great awe. For this reason, there's no movement in the rock. Now, the interesting part is this, for me, fascinating, this next line. One who looks upon the rock from behind, it appears to you that there's no life in this person. Looking at the person from behind, who's absolutely still because they're absolutely in awe. But in truth, there is true life there. Now, the interesting part of this, among other things, is that, we can see the face of an animal. But according to the way Yaakov Leiner is constructing it, we can never see the face of the rock, no matter which side we go on. You'd have to be on God's throne to see the rock's face. We can never get close enough in to look out and see the face of the rock. It's always closer in than we can ever be. So we only see rocks from behind, as it were, from the back. We never get to see them from the front. Because of that, we don't see the life that's in them. But that life is true life.
That's really striking because of the meeting of Moshe with Hashem on Mount Sinai. Hine makomiti b'nikrat hatzur. So that's reminding us of the tzur, and God can only be seen from behind.
Yeah, so make sure you translate the Hebrew.
So God says to Moses, here's a place with me in the tzur. In the
cleft of the rock, the nikrat.
Yeah, well, but what is that nikrat tzur? It could mean something else slightly. It's a kind of an odd construction.
Okay.
That's really striking. Because God can only be seen from behind, and if the rock can only be seen from behind, then it's definitely an image of God.
Yes, all the more so. Very good point, which I had not thought of before. Everyone got that? Yeah. Yes? Does anyone not get that? Speak up. Moshe is told he can see God from the back, but not from the front, not from the face. But more importantly, from what Simcha is saying, is that somehow Moshe has to be in the Nikrat Hatzor, the something of the rock. The cleft of the rock is how it's usually translated. But somehow being in relationship to the rock is the place Moshe needs to be in order to see God from behind. And maybe there's more to that than we normally think about. Maybe it's not just an empty place in the middle of a rock that you can look out from and be sheltered. Maybe there's something about being in the rock, meaning being merged with the perspective of the rock. What's going on there? That's brilliant. That's brilliant. Yeah, Simcha, thank you for adding. Here's another idea about the image of God from Schneur Zalman, which we'll go over quickly now, just to add it in to our discussion. So he's talking about how everything emerges from the combination and recombination of the letters of God's name. So there are many names of God, and everything in the universe is made up of those letters of God's name. And therefore, on that level, everything, whether everything is in God's image is a separate question, but everything is at least derived from God's image, which is embedded in the names of God. At least derived from God's image. So here's his explanation for stone. There's a certain charm to it also, I think, quaintness to how he describes it. A stone, which is Evan in Hebrew. So we're using a different word for stone. Before we were using the word for rock, sor. Now we're using something. Sor can mean a sor as big as a mountain, as Ellen was saying. An Evan, a stone, really is something you can more or less hold in your hand. That's a stone.
But a sor could also be a flint, which is a stone that sparks a fire.
Actually. Yeah, that's a good point. There's a lot of words in Hebrew like that where there's some specific meaning and some much more general meaning that they can have. So Evan tends to mean something that's more of a rock that you can hold in your hand, or at least a rock, like Evan Masu Habonim, the foundation stone, something you build with. It's something that can be used by, its size is on a scale that it can be used by or held by, or in some way be in relationship to the human body. It's of a scale that's not out of sync with the human body on some level, right? So Evan. What is it? Her name points out that her root is in the exalted name, whose number is Ban, Bet Nun, 52. Now, if you don't know about Lurianic Kabbalah, that won't mean anything to you offhand. But basically, if you spell the name of God, Yud He Vav He, if you spell out the letters, like Yud Vav Dalet is Yud, which makes 20, because it's 10 plus 6 plus 4. If you spell out all of the letters of God's name, there's two different ways to spell the letter Vav, and there's, well, two or three. You can spell Vav, 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 or Vav, Yud, Vav, or Vav, Aleph, Vav. And you can spell Hey, Hey, Yud, or Hey, Hey, or Hey, Aleph. So depending on how you spell the letters, they add up to different numbers. And one of the numbers they add up to is 52. So that's associated with God's essence. The four numbers in Lurianic Kabbalah are 45, 52, 63, and 72, based on different combinations of spelling Yud, He, Vav, He, and adding up all the letters. So 52 is one of them. So he's going to say here, what he's saying here is that Ben, Ban, it's usually pronounced Ban, although it looks like Ben, is something that must be connected to Evan because it has the word Ban, Bet Nun in it. And a further Aleph is added to her from another name for a reason known only to God. We will never know the reason, but God knows the reason. And behold, the name Ban in itself is in very high worlds, meaning, beyond anything that we can know with our consciousness. Very, very high worlds. Olamot elyonim me'od. But by means of numerous and powerful contractions, tzimtzum we're talking about, from level to level, they're descended from this exalted name of God that's connected to the number Ban, 52. There descends from that source, life force concentrated so much that it could actually be placed in a stone. It clothes itself in a stone. And this is the soul of the silent one, which makes it live and brings it into being from nothing to something in every moment. So now we have two Hasidic teachers telling us that rocks are alive in different ways. And they're not the only ones who say this, but there's two of the people that say it in what I found to be the most beautiful way that I really thought we should share and talk about. I really wanted to put in the book. So if that element of the earth, which is the most categorized as lower ones as opposed to the upper ones, would be the rock. Not the soil, because the soil is already full of what we can recognize as life. But the rock, before it's been broken down and enervated with life, with what we think of as, macro life, plants and fungus and all that kind of stuff, but also bacteria, all the kinds of life that go into soil. A rock doesn't have that going on necessarily, but even there, it's full of life, according to these teachers. So how do we become sensitive to that quality of life is a question that is not dealt with in the book, but it's sort of the question that you need to ask if you want the stuff that's here to change us in some way. It's one thing to have a beautiful idea and savor it, which is definitely valuable in itself. But then how do we take these ideas and go beyond enjoying them into being changed by them? So how do we create a sensitivity that enables us to know the consciousness that's in the rocks around us, not just in the plants, not just in the animals, not just in the soil? And Ellen, you were talking about that already, and that was beautiful. Yeah. Do you want to add more to it? Or would anyone else like to add to it? Go ahead, Toby.
For me, it is one of those places where what we learn in science helps to increase my own feeling, and maybe I'm too much in my head, but when I think about the rock at the center of our earth, the spinning ball of iron, it is what creates the magnetic field which makes life possible. Mm-hmm. And so I feel like glimpses like that help me to have awe for the importance of those aspects of the world that otherwise don't seem to be as obviously moving or in relationship with us. And at the same time, I grew up in the Southwest, right, in the desert, and there's a lot of rock. And for me, some of those most precious like tastes of spirituality as a child were in sitting and observing. And I feel like that's true of so much of the more than human world, right? Is just the being silent and the observing and the being aware. Like the more that we open up, just paying attention, those answers come to us.
Sure. Yeah. Someone else want to add their own thoughts?
Well, I like what you said, and it's about paying attention to like the possibility that this could be something holy and we don't know it. And there's an image for me that's personal about being on sacred ground, that it took me a long time to realize that it helps me to think that where I'm standing is sacred ground. And I think the more I can be aware of sacredness in the world and see it and interact with it, then I'm more alive, and I'm more who I am, rather than being splintered off by all the stuff that's happening in the news and all the things that are shrunk down into words. So just being aware of the possibility of the power that we just don't pay any attention to would help us treat the planet and treat people and the land a lot better.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Sure.
What is this doing? I wanted to add one thing. I don't know if you can still hear me because my screen is doing something else. Can you hear me?
We are hearing you, Ellen, and
Okay.
you might just be easier just to turn off your video while you're talking so that you come through clearly.
Okay, but there's something blocking my screen. Anyway, several people have said it, but the idea of reverence for all life, which is connected with awe, which is connected with all of the interconnected reality, is partly related to our conscious mind is maybe 10%. And then they talk about the subconscious and unconscious and all that stuff, but it's really 90% is the other than conscious, from where we have awe for a flower or for a particular stone or for a mountain or for just even the idea of the mycelial levels and all of the interconnectedness with everything. And when we're willing to use the other than conscious, then it's not so strange, and we don't feel awkward kind of spilling out into much larger areas where there's so much love, there's so much support, and where we're kind of needing to get to so we don't complete the destruction that we've been doing.
Mm-hmm.
I will mute.
I think when I was a child and I would go swimming, and then I would come out of the water and I would lie on the rocks, they would feel warm and they felt alive. And I think when you're a child, sometimes you feel these things in a way that sometimes they get lost when you get older.
Definitely.
I'm starting to think about the challenge of relating an infinity to a non-infinity, and that's at the crux of kind of what is the principle, you know, if A equals B, then B equals C. Well, if we're in the image of the Creator, then it doesn't seem like image can be quantified to how much, you know, a little bit. I mean, And so then if the creator can see,
Thank you so much.
creative things with intention, then how can, I guess it's a little bit still, the creator could have created things with intention, but not in the creator's image. And yet it almost seems semantic, because when we can feel relationship to things, whether they're traditionally in Western Cartesian thinking animate or not, is less interesting, is less relevant. I don't know how that argument holds up.
I'm not sure. What I'm thinking about is that if we want to say rocks are alive, surely we don't want to say that their life is the same as the life of a plant or an animal. It's a different kind of life, if we want to use the term life. And so in a way, it's just a question of how we label it, because everyone's going to agree that a rock isn't alive in the same way that a plant is alive. And the question is, in what sense does it mean? Is it meaningful to talk about it as alive or conscious? What does it mean to say that? And I'm not sure we need to figure that out. But what I'm reluctant to do is mush everything together and just say, oh, well, it's all alive, it's all conscious, and just kind of leave it there. I'm very interested in the differences in what we think of as consciousness in this place versus that place.
Well, one of the things that rocks certainly have is resonance.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, here we are using computers, which at the bottom of, inside the computer in the smallest level, there's thin layers of silicon that are vibrating it with certain electrical energies. And so it's not quite life, but it's resonance, and it's allowing us to have this amazing interaction. And I think that's very, like, there's some like little line there. It's like, like the spark from the flint isn't fire, and yet it's very close to it.
Mm-hmm. Nice metaphor. Or maybe more than metaphor, I should say. I also want to bring in some other aspects of science that people have alluded to. So people understand what stellar nucleosynthesis is? Maybe, or maybe not.
That's what happens inside a star?
Mm-hmm. So you may know already that the only elements that would be formed out of what people understand to be the Big Bang, the way physicists understand it, would be hydrogen and helium. Maybe, and some lithium, and maybe a small amount of beryllium relative to the whole. So those are the first 4 elements in the periodic table that have 1, 2, 3, or 4 protons in their nucleus. But in order to get more protons together in a nucleus, you have to have extraordinary pressure to get them to merge. So the way it works is that, as you know, like charges repel each other, right? Positive and positive repel each other until they get within a certain distance, at which point the strong nuclear force takes over and binds them together. It only has a very short radius in which it can act. And the extraordinary pressure of gravity plus energy that happens inside a star is necessary to get anything over the 4th element to form, including almost everything that we're made out of, including carbon, oxygen, all these things. So, including iron, everything up to, I think it's iron, can form inside a star that we think of as a normal star, but everything above iron can only form through more extraordinary events like supernova or neutron stars colliding with each other, this kind of thing. That's the only thing that can get those masses of protons that have even stronger repulsion to get close enough to join together. And you may know this already, but I'm sure not everyone knows this, so I'll just say it. The reason why elements are radioactive is because the nucleus is too big and the strong nuclear force is not enough to keep all the protons together, to put it in a very simple way. And so that's why things like uranium can be split and release their energy. So all that is happening inside stars. So if everything in the heavens is in God's image, which is what the rabbis firmly believed and what the Kabbalists also firmly believed, and all these things that we're made out of are formed inside stars in the heavens, then there's just a very fundamental way. Forget about what the Hasidic Rebbe said that we just studied. Even without that, all of this that we think of as the lower realms is the highest expression of the upper realms. You know, we are the heavens, put it that way. And it's not just us, but the rock Dafka is made out of these elements that are formed inside stars. And then those elements join together in various ways, perhaps in interstellar space. Then a bunch of them get together and form a big enough rock to be a planet. And all this is coming from inside of stars, or through the interactions of stars. So in that sense, if we take the rabbinic paradigm seriously, everything is already completely the image of God. But they wouldn't have known that because they didn't know how other elements form. Which brings up for me something that relates to, was it Karen who was saying this? Connecting the science. We were talking about the bedrock also, connecting the science to the Kabbalah, the mysticism. Because, oh no, it was Toby who was talking about this. When you go into the science in a deep way, it's not that there's science and that there's religion and that they talk about different realms in different ways and so you can't compare them. They actually mesh together in a deep way that transforms both. It's not just we learn from science in a way that informs religion, is that what we learn in religion can change how we understand science as well. And that's equally important, I believe. So, but the question still becomes, how do you use these metaphors of consciousness, of life, in ways that are precise enough that they actually can be useful to us when we think in terms of science and not just in terms of religion? That's part of the question that I have. This comes up in a different way, and I talk about this in the chapter. I wasn't going to do this inside the text, but to talk about it outside the text. When we talk about DNA and codes and the mysticism of how letters recombine and in order to form all the creatures of the planet. So for Schneur Zalman, Evan, the stone, is made up of Ban 52, which alludes to a divine name, plus an aleph added to it by the creator. If everything emerges from these kinds of codes, combining and recombining, DNA becomes a kind of metaphor that we can use for talking about all creation and not just about life in this sense. People have tried to equate Kabbalah with science on that basis, to say that the metaphor of DNA actually is already prefigured in Kabbalah by its mysticism about how letters combine to form creation. And that's certainly fascinating. It's also possible to ignore the fact that it's not the same. Saying this thing about science and saying this thing about Kabbalah are not the same thing, even though they sound similar to our ears. So I'm just interested in all these differences and all these analogies that are both true and also false, depending on how you look at them. I wonder if my approach is a little overly intellectual, though, sometimes. And that's why it's often really helpful to me to be talking about this kind of stuff with you all.
Rabbi, do you mean the sameness because of the codes? That there's something inherent in the fact that there's a code or that things go by?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'll read you, for example, here's a quote from Arthur Green. I'll just read this out loud. This is on page 238, but I'm not going to put it up on the screen because I don't think we need to have it on the screen. Actually, no, it's going to be easier for you if I put it on the screen, so I will put it on the screen just for a moment. For the initiate, the Sephirot serve as rungs or marking points of the mystic's inward journey. All the rungs of descent and potential ascent are contained in each soul. But that is true even in demythologized form. This is Arthur Green trying to equate science with Kabbalah. All of our ancestors, each stage and many step in the evolution of life that brought us to where we are today are present within us. The DNA that constitutes the life identity of each of us exists indeed, zecher lama'aseh v'reshit, in memory of the act of creation, linking us back to our most remote origins. So this is a common idea. Here's another version of it. Oops, I'm having a little trouble with that. There we go. Everything has its unique numerical and alphabetical constitution, right? Shlomo Blickstein discussing Kabbalah and the idea of emanation. Everything has a kind of mystical genetic code, which is the ground of its being. So that makes sense as a metaphor. It can be beautiful as a metaphor. On the other hand, it kind of mushes things together in a way where the different senses and different flavors of ideas get lost because we want to say that everything's the same as everything else. So it just becomes complicated in a way that I think is interesting, but I also think can be overly intellectual. So maybe the distinctions that I'm bringing up don't matter as much as just getting this feeling that somehow Kabbalah intuits a reality that science intuits in a different way. But they both point towards a common reality. Maybe that's what's important.
Isn't that as simple as as what you were talking about, the stardust? You know, the stardust that exists in everything. I mean, what you just read, isn't that simple in a way?
Yes.
Instead of being mushy.
Right. Instead of being mushy. Yes. And I like this verse as a way of paying attention to that idea. Oops. Ma'adir shimcha b'chol ha'aretz. How mighty is your name through all the earth, which is a verse we repeat multiple times during the high holidays, in the Amida, actually, in the Kedusha of the Amida. Ma'adir shimcha b'chol ha'aretz. Does that sound familiar to people? V'haya Adonai lemelech kol haaretz bayom hahu yeh Adonai echad u'shemo echad would be the Ashkenazi nusach for those lines. Yeah.
I can only speak from my own personal experience, you know,
Go
but
for it.
I am both someone who's way too much in my head, and also when it comes to the question that you're proposing, I feel sort of intellectually sloppy about it. And I know that from my own inner experience of davening, that it is the images that the Hubble Space Telescope, that these images of physics, that the origin of ourselves in stars and stardust, like those are the things that open my heart and my experience to the divine. Mm-hmm. And I struggle far more to relate to a personal image of God or a personal relationship to God in some sort of personified way. But these things that science has made as images and metaphors and descriptions are the things that get me there.
Mhm.
But at the same time, I am not a rabbi, and I'm not responsible for other people's spiritual lives. So that's where the sloppiness comes in. Like, it works for me as in the same way that poetry does, that a certain combination of words in English or Hebrew opens my heart. These things do too.
Right.
And I would feel a greater need for intellectual rigor if, as you, I am responsible for guiding other people there.
Sure. Yeah, that makes sense. But I find those things inspiring too, probably in more or less the same way that you do, Toby. But then how do you write about it in a way that isn't just private, isn't just about its private meaning to you? And it's just interesting. We don't have to figure that out right now. I don't actually mean to belabor the point or the question so much, just to put it out as an interesting question to think about.
But it does seem important, because if what is missing is a sense amongst, our Jewish communities, plural, or the world beyond Jewish community, to have some sense of the sacredness of the world that we move through in order to treat it more responsibly and to be in better relationship, then it does matter very much.
Yes. But then that also gets back to the other question we were talking about, which is how do you get permission from the mountain to quarry stone from it in order to build things? How do you know when you're using something in a way that's well enough, conscious enough, good enough, that you can imagine, say, the cow or the cow species saying, yes, we're okay with being sacrificed.
Or how much
Because
is
of a greater purpose, a holy purpose. And we're down with that. We want to be part of that. How can you ever say that an individual cow is ready to be sacrificed?
I just wanted to say that I think you did write about it really beautifully in this chapter. I really appreciated this chapter.
Jim was writing. I usually forget, Jim, to look at the chat, but I just did look at it because I saw what you come up. The cow shows you clearly that it's not okay. It is not okay with being killed. You can clearly see that it is not. And actually, of course, that makes a lot of sense, what you're saying, Jim. I also have some questions about it, though, because it seems to me that, well, the cow wouldn't be okay with getting eaten by a wolf either, right? Or the lamb is not going to be okay with being eaten by a wolf on an individual level. And yet, in order for lambs or wolves to exist, yes, we are not wolves, I agree. But in order for lambs or wolves to exist, they have this relationship, which they are mutually dependent. It's not just that the wolf needs the lamb needs the wolf too, in some ways. And that's how the ecosystem works. And the ecosystem is in the image of God more than any of the species in it are in the image of God. It is comprised of all the species. It comprises all the species together. And we can say, well, because we're conscious in a certain way that other species aren't, we can choose not to be doing that. And that's for sure true. Nobody needs to be eating meat, to use the
But the animals need to do it to choose life. And if the idea is choosing life and somebody needed to do it to eat, because there wasn't anything other alternative.
Yes.
I
But
also,
we have an alternative. We could not eat animals on the one hand. On the other hand, we have a relationship, say, with chickens, where chickens would not be really around in the world, except that we use them so much. Yeah. And so if you can imagine the spirit of chickens speaking to us as opposed to an individual chicken, and the spirit of chickens, again, we're engaging in kind of fantasy when we talk this way, but the spirit of chickens might say, I want to exist. I want my species to exist. The guardian angel of chickens could say, I want my species to exist. And in order for it to exist, it does this by being in relationship to human beings. And so the guardian angel of the chickens, again, I'm being a little tongue-in-cheek, but not entirely. The guardian angel of the chickens might say, Yes, we understand that I understand that you're going to eat my charges. You're going to eat my chickens. But if you're going to raise them and give them life, then I can accept that bargain. But only when you're raising them in a way which gives them life, that's a beautiful life. That only when you are letting them reproduce in a way that's fulfills their needs as animals. You know, there's all kinds of ways to imagine it, where we have a relationship with another species. It includes eating individuals of that species. But it includes taking responsibility for the well-being of the species, which means not using it just for our own benefit, but allowing ourselves to be used for its benefit.
So
And that is, yes.
making this, the chapter writing that you have done, is making this accessible to a lot of people who wouldn't be able to even come near it, as far as being under the rubric of being Jewish. But I think maybe writing isn't the most efficient way. It's like, I just came back from a whole week of storytelling. And if you tell the story and talk with people like you're doing with us now, it's easier to transmit a bigger idea and the energies. And I just think writing isn't effective for everything, every kind of expression.
Sure.
And you know, such a loss of storytelling, and I hope it changes, but the storytelling and what the Kabbalah and the Baal Shem Tov are doing, they probably were able to bridge that gap and explain it better, or have people feel more settled with it and feel that they could use it.
Yes. I didn't get into the book as much as I have in subsequent research, but the idea that it's not the species or the human being that is in God's image, but the way the human is in relationship to other beings, that's the image of God, not the person itself, right? And so that kind of relationship that reflects the image of God, I believe, is the kind of relationship that we call a covenant. So to be in a covenantal relationship with another species means not abusing it, not turning it into something unnatural, not being involved with its life in a way that causes it pain. And a lot of the kinds of species we've created through breeding are, what it means for them to live is to be in a kind of state of torture, right? Especially, you know, like some of the chickens that are bred to be create so much breast meat that they can't walk, this kind of thing. That's torture, right? The way we raise animals in concentrated animal feeding operations is torture. But we can imagine a few thousand years ago a different kind of relationship, and what it meant to domesticate an animal was not just to use it for your own sake, but to be used for its sake. And that what I think is true is that our ancestors understood their relationship with their animals, whether this is the reality or not. They understood their relationship with animals as something which was mutual, and it was a domestication that went in both directions. Yeah. So the animal species that we're in relationship with to domesticate us to serve their needs, and we domesticate them to serve our needs. And in a right relationship, which can be called a covenant, these needs are mutual and mutually reinforcing, and that works out okay. We could say the same thing about the mountain. That is, yes, I agree, Jim. Cats domesticated humans, not the other way around. It's a fun way to look at it, a meaningful way to look at it. What was I saying? Oh yeah, so the mountain. So how can we be in a covenantal relationship with the mountain so that when we quarry stone, we can at least have a reasonable assurance that what we're doing is serving the higher meaning, needs, reality of what the mountain is, and not just our own needs. And that would include not using things in a way that destroys life, which is what we're doing when we use oil from the ground, for example. So oil can be seen as in the category of rocks, petroleum, the rocks that we use, fracking rocks. This is all has to do with manipulating rocks, which according to our Hasidic rabbis, we just were looking at, have souls, have life in them. But we're using them in order to create a substance which actually destroys life. There's no way you could think of that as a covenantal relationship. If rocks are alive, if rocks participate in life, then they surely are not wanting to exist in order to destroy life the way we're using them. And I've said this about water in a different week. We talked about this specifically, that when you frack with water, you put it down into the ground in a way where it can't come back up. A good half of it doesn't ever come back up. And that water is no longer part of the system of life. It no longer gets to participate in creating life. And if we take a panpsychic view of the world, which I think is pointed to by the text about rock that we were just reading, panpsychic means that everything has soul. Everything is full of soul in some sense, which is not the same as consciousness, but it's very closely connected to consciousness. So we're talking about psyche, soul, panpsychism. And so it doesn't necessarily mean the idea of soul that has all this baggage connected to the afterlife, and only humans have souls and our souls get to go to heaven or to go to the world to come or whatever we want to call it. It's not necessarily that idea of soul. It's more like animism. But if everything has soul in it, and everything has soul which is expressed through the phenomenon of life, so that the universe is both ensouled and alive, then everything we do in order to be in a covenantal relationship with the thing we use, and also with the whole that we're in relationship to, that we're in the middle of as we use this species or that rock or whatever, all of those relationships need to be balanced in a way that they add to life and not decrease it. So we have a few different measures that we can use, right? One is, how does my relationship with this species increase its life in the world as a species? How does my relationship with this species increase the amount of life in this ecosystem that it's part of? And then how does it affect the idea or the reality or the livingness of life in the universe in a broad sense? You know, and these all become yardsticks. So any ethical action will fit all of those scales. It will increase life on all of those scales, not just one and not just the other, but all of them. And anything that doesn't do that, we could say, is what we would call sin. Which, by the way, brings us directly to Aldo Leopold's definition of ethics. People know who Aldo Leopold is? Go like this if you know who he is. So Aldo Leopold was a forester, also a hunter. 1940s, he was writing about a different kind of ethics. He called it the land ethic, where why don't we just look it up? Because I can look it up. I'm going to look it up on my website and show you where it is. Neo-Hasid, land ethic. And here's the link. I'm going to put it in the chat. That's the link you can go to, but we'll share it on the screen right now. This is excerpts from this longer essay. Mind you, in this essay, he also talks about Abraham, and he's totally wrong. Everything he says about Abraham is wrong, incorrect, bad reading of the text. But you know, he wasn't a rabbi. What he said about ecology was great. What he said about religion was maybe not always right. Here, very simply, this line in yellow: a thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. It is wrong when it tends otherwise. A very, very big idea on the one hand, and also a very simple idea that we can apply to everything. And I think that this idea is congruent with the kind of ethics and spirituality and existentialism that's part of the Hasidic rabbis that we were just reading. It goes along with it. They wouldn't have been able to formulate this idea because, again, they didn't have the idea of ecosystems even the way we have it. But had they had that idea, this is what would fit the theology that they articulate about rocks, about animals. It fits what the Kabbalah says about life in general. The whole point of human action from a Hasidic perspective, and also often from a Kabbalistic perspective, Hasidism is kind of like simplified Kabbalah, is to increase the power of Chesed over the power of Gevurah, so that the balance, you can't live without Gevurah, but so the balance is shifted more towards Chesed, which means towards more abundance and more life. That's always the shift. And the other shift that Hasidism is always invested in is bringing together the Kudsha Brichu and the Shechina, the masculine and feminine dimensions of the divine, which is equivalent to making the divine more manifest in the physical world and on all levels, not just on the human level. So when we do those things, both of those things together, anything that does both of those things together is also increasing life in the world, in the scientific sense of life, not just in the spiritual sense of life, which is what Aldo Leopold is talking about. It's worth reading this whole essay, by the way, if you want to go to this page on my website. It's fairly simple, but beautiful, I would say. It's now 3:19. Who would like to say some more? Uranium. I want to read what Toby said in the comments before I go on here. There is a sense, I've been told, among both Pueblo people and indigenous people in Australia that the uranium under their land was a living, powerful being. Yeah, that's really interesting, Toby. I would love to learn more about that. Scientifically, the idea that the heat of the uranium in the planet may be part of what creates the molten layer, plate tectonics, and the potential for life to have been developed on this planet. Yes, I've also heard that. Life misused creates death. Also, yes. So uranium has a place in the scheme of life, and it's not in nuclear bombs. And it's not in nuclear power plants that are releasing radiation into the environment. Life depends on radiation being where it is and not where it shouldn't be. Or where it should be and not where it shouldn't be. There's nothing that is inherently antithetical to life that's part of the universe. It's all a matter of where it's located, what it's in relationship to. It's all about relationships, always.
I went to I've been going to the Slow Living Festival in Brattleboro, Vermont, but it's on Zoom. And Ben and Jerry's talked about reducing their carbon footprint. And the ultimate way they were going to reduce the carbon footprint was by helping the soil get back to where it's supposed to be, so that the carbon stays in the soil. And it's like, it just made me realize everything is in a cycle, and we've totally forgotten that if we got it back healthy, it would work.
Yeah.
And,
do you want to put a link for that, Nayana, in the chat?
Yeah, there's still some going on.
Sounds like it would be fun to pop in on.
Yeah, it's a Slow Living, is it? I think I'm not sure I have it exactly, but
if you have a chance to look up in the chat before we finish, which will be in a minute.
I'll look it up. Okay.
Yeah. Would anyone else like to add some thoughts before we sign off here?
Yeah, I would. So
thank you, Jim, for the reference. Rita, were you saying something?
Yes, I'm living in Aldo Leopold's neighborhood now.
No.
And I've struggled with how important the importance he places on hunting or, acquiring animal foods as part of being connected, living with the land. Just the last week, I accompanied a neighbor who grew up in way northern Wisconsin up to that area so she could attend an elderly uncle's funeral. And we walked her family's homeland, acres of forested and meadows. And she said to me, she was talking about her brother who passed, and it was so helpful. She said, oh, he used to plant deer gardens, pumpkins and squash that they'd really like, and they'd come and graze on it. And then when it was hunting season, he would harvest her brother and his friends would harvest what was needed for the family's sustenance.
Mm-hmm.
And that just helped me. I mean, she's so attached to the land. That was so helpful for me.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Other closing comments people want to make?
David, I'm still really hung up on the tzur.
Go on. Say.
So in Hebrew, the word tzur is the same root as, or it's a conjugation or a declension of the same root as yotzer, as which is not creation but formation, perhaps.
Right.
And so I'm just really this thing about the nikrat tzur in the story of Moses, because that's kind of like, it suggests not just, I mean, it's clearly meaning the cleft of the rock, but it suggests the chance creation or the chance existence of the tzur, of this kind of rock, and
You mean
also
the root like mikre? Is that what you mean?
yeah.
Okay.
And that's a kuf resh hey, and that I'm just still I'm very tired, so it hasn't quite settled into my brain, but it's a very interesting combination of things, and why this is because of I mean, I think that there's references to God as Evan as well, but
Yes.
primarily when we talked about God, if we use a mineral term for God, it's tzur, and that it says a lot more than just the rock, which I can hold on to and doesn't move, but also all these other things as well.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Definitely. So a literal translation of tzur using the root yotzer, right? Yud Sadi Resh, the one who shapes, who gives shape to something. You could translate it as shape. Yeah, it's a shape, and the rocks can be any shape, basically. So that shape shiftiness, so to speak, is what's characteristic of rock. It doesn't have to have to use the term people use in I think in genetics or in biology, a bow plan. It doesn't have to have a structural plan like we have a bilateral body plan. And in general, all body plans of most living things have some kind of symmetries. And a rock, although the crystalline structure of rocks that are made of, that have such a structure is very symmetrical, but a rock doesn't have to have any symmetry in that sense. It can be any shape in a way that things that are alive can't be any shape. Live in the biological sense of life, not in this panpsychic sense of life. So yeah, so that's interesting to think about too. I agree. Simcha. I'm not sure if I'm getting at what's interesting to you about it, but it's interesting to me also in its own way. There's more to say, as always, which we're gonna leave off for now. I can say that next week we're gonna do chapter 9, which is much bigger. It's a lot of material there and a lot of different ideas. But one of the ideas that we're going to get to in chapter 9, which is really important to think about, is that chapter 9 has some texts that talk about the soil being the image of God, or being part of the image of God, which is different than rocks. So here we're talking about rocks. Next week we're going to be talking about soil itself as participating in life and in God's image in a unique way. And between the two, we're covering kind of all the bases of what people in medieval and ancient times thought of as the lower levels of the tree of life, or the ladder of life, to say that those lowest levels are also part of the image of God. really, once you have established that fact, which isn't that hard to establish, you open the door to a very expansive eco-theology, which is what we're doing, which is what I'm trying to do with the book, basically. An expansive eco-theology that really can revolutionize how we do ethics and how we see ourselves in relationship to the world. So we will continue that journey tomorrow. Or not tomorrow, in a week. Next Tuesday. Thank you for being with me, everyone.
Thank you.
For having the discussion. Yeah, you're all welcome.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Goodbye, everyone. And have a great week and great Shabbos.
You too.
Bye. Thanks.
Thank you, Reb David. Remember, you're the
I'm the host now, so I need to figure out how to record, how to get the recording to work.
Stop the recording, and yeah.
Once you sign off, it will save it in a folder. Well, this does for me. It will save it in a Zoom folder in your documents. That's what happens on my computer. I don't know. Or my
this is recording on the cloud, though.
Or if you're recording the cloud, then it'll be saved into Zoom on your Zoom account, I guess.
We'll find out. Hopefully it worked out. Did you also record Simcha in case I messed it up?
I'm recording on the cloud, but when I gave the hosting over to you, the control of the recording seems to have gone over to you as well.
Okay, so I'm going to make you host again.
Oh, okay.
So you can do whatever, if there's anything to do.
You can have co-hosts too. You don't have to make.
Yeah, I haven't figured out how to do that, though.
You just say make
Only,
co-hosts.
I don't remember.
You go
You're
into
made host now, Simcha.
participants,
Okay, everyone.
Okay,
Right.
I'm
Goodbye.
the host.
co-hosts. Okay,
Stop
bye-bye.
recording.